But is this on? Yes. Good evening, everybody. I am so pleased to see all of you here, and it's a little odd for me to be here because, as mentioned, the Toronto Maple Leafs are playing. And if the world had not radicalized me, I would be there. But I'm here. So I write for The Star. I write all kinds of stuff now. Alex wrote all kinds of stuff, and then since COVID, there's going to be a lot of since COVID in this conversation, I think. She has written almost exclusively and really wonderfully about disinformation, misinformation, and the world that we find ourselves living and swimming together in. I wanted to start this with this. There's a lot of things that when I talk to younger people that make me feel old. Like when you talk to people about how when you were a kid, maybe you didn't have to wear seatbelts, right? Or like smoking in bars, you'd have to get home at 2 a.m. and shower. Otherwise, your clothes would stink. Like all this, like what it was like before we had email addresses and trying to arrange going to a movie with your friends. There's all these things that we've left in the past, and it makes it feel like they're a million years ago. And one of the things that makes me feel old is that I say that when I was a kid, I didn't know what disinformation meant. It existed, but it didn't. There was a signal in society, and it wasn't always right, but there was a signal through newspapers, through television, through radio, essentially those three. But if I wanted like I was born in 1974. If I wanted in 1988 to convince someone of a truly awful idea, I had to go out in the street and hand them a pamphlet. And that world doesn't exist anymore. And so both Alex and I, when we write about this stuff, you almost have to remind yourself about how recent, not the ideas are, but how disinformation works, how it transmits, and how it is not exclusive to one side of the political aisle or to people of a certain age or anything. Like it can affect everybody. Do you want to speak to that at all, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest misconceptions I run up against in my work as the misinformation reporter is this idea that it's an issue that only affects other people. And I understand why we think that. I think it's psychologically safer to think that that's a problem over there. That's not really, a big issue for people like me. But I think, A, that's inaccurate. And B, that leaves us all vulnerable to it. I think we're not great at defining misinformation. I think, obviously, we're going to get to that a little bit more. But yeah, I think not acknowledging the wide spectrum of what it can look like, how it impacts us, leaves us all vulnerable to kind of the issues of a very inaccurate and very disordered information ecosystem.
Yeah, so like if you look at how we got here, really it kind of started in the 1990s in terms of an organized push, right? Like anti-vaccine stuff it goes back as far as polio. It goes as far back as you kind of want to go. But in the 1990s, things start to change politically in the United States, especially after repealing of the fair, help me.
Oh, we're going to Google.
Yes.
Fairness
yes. Doctrine, thank you. And Rush Limbaugh starts to happen, and Fox News is founded in 1996. And if you remember, one of the things that defined the Clinton presidency was the murder of a guy named Vince Foster. He was in a Washington Park. He got shot. And there was an entire conspiracy architecture built around the fact that the Clintons killed him. And we forget that now, right? Because like a lot of things happened under Bill Clinton. And it's a long time ago. But that was an enormous and completely baseless story. And that's one of the first times in my life where I remember going, what is that? Because I'd never encountered anything like that before.
Not to correct you, I think, the 80s, the 90s is definitely when this got going. Did you know Harper's Magazine wrote an article about fake news in like 1912?
Tell me about that.
It's a great read. You can Google it. It's online. It's like a PDF. But they're very, very worried about this idea of printing fake news. So articles that weren't true. But it's all about the things people kind of like the things they do to try to manipulate editors to get fake stories into the newspaper. Like, it's literally fake news. So, like, they're lying to you. They pretend to be someone else. They, make up data and try to get it into your newspaper in order to get, their business some attention or something. And so it's so interesting to me that we have been talking about this for so long, but at the same time, the mechanisms of it are so different. Like, the article, brings a tear to my eye a little bit because it really lionizes the role of editors, because it really presents them as kind of, you are the line of defense. You are the ones who need to make sure that people aren't lying to you and that you don't print these things in your newspaper. And I think, to me, that has been one of the big changes. Like you say, with Fox News, with social media, as newspaper people, we are no longer the gatekeepers. And I think this is also, people email about this all the time, being like, why don't you not write about these people and they would just go away? And I say, I hate to break it to you, but Joe Rogan has a much bigger audience than arguably The Star does in a lot of ways. And so, again, it's not something that we are able to control happening or not happening because of all these other ways of getting information out there. Yeah.
Well, and you're right, because what we've had is basically in the post-war, post-First World War, but more the post-Second World War era, we had what was a real golden age in information. Newspapers were immensely powerful. They used to talk about the Miami Herald, which was one of the most incredible newspapering environments ever. In the 1980s, if you worked at the Miami Herald, you were dealing with drugs, with crime, with unbelievable corruption. And the best part about working for the Miami Herald is if someone tried to sue you, the Miami Herald had "fuck you" money. And they would say, "fuck you." And that's, their reporters could be fearless. And that was kind of one of the high water marks. You get up to about the year 2000 is when newspaper revenues peak in North America. And newspapers aren't the only kind of bastion in this, but I think they're the widest and strong. They were the widest and strongest one in terms of diversity and depth of topics that were discussed. But there was really a golden age that ends right around the time I get into newspapers, actually, starts to end. And so Alex is right, we have, on the one hand, a changing media environment. So the Star gets to about 200,000 people a day, largely, but not exclusively, over the age of 50, which is wonderful. Like, our readers are amazing, and they've stuck with us through all kinds of stuff. But that is, we are not getting to people under 30, almost ever. And if you look at what's happened with television doesn't reach people under 30. Who here grew up watching the evening news, like 6 o'clock, right? Like, that's how you found out what happened that day. And it was a short list, but you knew there was a signal. And what's happened since, as the internet has changed, it took the internet a while to really do this. And I think we can kind of point to two very obvious supercharging moments. And one is 2016 and Donald Trump being elected. That's the effect of a lot of misinformation and not only that, not just disinformation, but lack of information. And that repeats again in 24. But COVID was the first mass information trauma event of pretty much anyone's lifetime, right? Like, I talked to a guy who was a medical student in World War II here in Toronto, and I asked him, how did World War II change your life? He said they melted down the lampposts on the Gardner, and they turned them into tanks. I was like, anything else? He's like, no. I was like, okay. So in terms of let's go, I don't want to step on what Brian's going to talk about later because there's a lot of medical stuff. But COVID, to me, was like a misinformation asteroid. And when did you start to notice that?
That's the thing. Like, it seems so obvious now the role COVID played in terms of disinformation. But I, at least, had no idea, perhaps naively. But So I had been just kind of a national reporter when COVID hit. Obviously, when it hit, a lot of us were forced to pivot and learn very, very quickly a lot of things about viruses and public health and medical stuff that we just didn't know a lot about before. I'm sure, made lots of mistakes. I know we made mistakes along the way. I became committed to the COVID vaccine. That was what I wrote about a lot. And it was one of those beats I kind of like complained my way into, because I would come to work every day and I was just so fascinated by how the vaccine was being developed. And I would go to my boss and be like, is the health team doing this? Is the health team doing this? Is the health team doing this? And finally he was like, do you want to do some of this? And so I ended up writing about it more and more. And I am so grateful to the people who gave me so much of their time trying to explain some of these concepts to me. And one of them was the co-chair of the vaccine task force at the time. And I still remember one of my first conversations with him. And I remember saying, what do you think the biggest challenge of the vaccine rollout is going to be? And I assumed he'd say something like, oh, they're going to be really expensive, or like the logistics of getting these across the country, or geopolitics, or something. And I remember him looking at me and being like, no, it's going to be vaccine hesitancy and bad information. And I did not realize what a prescient statement that would turn out to be. Because, my job very quickly pivoted from trying to explain, how an mRNA vaccine works, to covering the ways in which misinformation was playing out, trying to get good information out there, but then also trying to explain why people had gone awry and some of the emotions and some of the forces driving that. Because I think, in my opinion anyway, I think it's a big part of what we do is trying to, again, we're not the gatekeepers of this stuff, so trying to contextualize it and explain it so that when people go out and see this bad information, they have more context or more understanding of why it's flowing the way it is.
Did anyone spot the craziest part of what she just said? Is that, looking back, everyone in this room would probably say, of course it was going to be bad information, right? But I would have done the exact same thing, because I didn't grow up around people who were vaccine hesitant, despite growing up in like a socialist co-op. Because vaccine hesitancy used to live almost exclusively, not entirely, but almost exclusively on the left, right? In terms of health, healthy eating people, like I grew up in BC, so we just called them granolas. But that still exists. Like, you wouldn't actually know it, but that still exists. In British Columbia, the least vaccinated district in the province, after First Nations reserves, was Salt Spring Island. If you ever go have coffee on Salt Spring Island, the odds that you'll see someone wearing a full-on wizard costume is like 1 in 3. I'm not joking. That's not a joke. But that exists. But then what has happened now, and what has happened specifically, is that the idea of disinformation or misinformation, vaccine hesitancy and stuff like that, a lot of it used to come from a relatively good place, right? And a kind of explicable place. Chemicals are bad for you. Of course they are. And the unknown is bad for you. But early on in the pandemic, really early, Andrew Coyne of the Globe and Mail wrote a piece. And it was, "Only Trust Can Save Us," was part of the headline. That's the part that has stuck with me ever since. It was the best piece anyone wrote in the whole pandemic. Because it was about trust in institutions. And when we get at the root of how misinformation gets you, a lot of it is stuff that you want to believe, and a lot of it is rooted in the fundamental mistrust that anyone will take care of you, that institutions are of good faith. So the 2 anti-vaxxers that I met personally at the start of the pandemic, both were parents at the club where my kids played tennis. And one of them was like a dietitian, healthy eating, and she would not do it. And the other one was a Romanian guy named Andre, really nice guy. We used to talk about yoga, but he grew up under communism. So you think when the government tells him he's going to do something, he's going to do it? And the next time I saw Andre during the pandemic was at a mall food court protest where they went in without masks. And I saw him on the news. And like, if you look at Eastern Europeans, disproportionately higher, who grew up under communism, that was a huge anti-vax aspect, right? But it's the same with everything in terms of organized misinformation. I would say that, what would you say would be the percentage of that's rooted in institutional mistrust?
I think that's a lot of it. Trust in institutions, trust in your social circle, trust in the community. You mentioned the anti-vaxxers that you know, which made me think of, I mean, I spoke to, a lot of people who had doubts or questions or whatever about the vaccine over the course of the pandemic. The one that really sticks with me is this person that I spoke to who, so just to roll back a little bit, part of Canada's strategy with vaccine acquisition was getting a selection of them. So in theory, we would end up, with a toolkit of vaccines. Some of them were good for some people, some of them were good for others, and that ended up happening because we were incredibly lucky, which I think is something that we really don't think about enough. But some people really took that to heart, and so I remember this one person who was like, you know what, I'm not anti-vaccine, but I work from home. I don't really interact with a lot of people. I think I'm pretty low risk. I don't want the first set of vaccines. I want one of the ones that's going to come later. It's a more traditional technology. I've done a lot of reading. I would just feel more comfortable with that. And
like not buying the first model year of a car. Never buy the first model year of a car. Same thing.
Yeah, and to be clear, there was absolutely no issues with the first ones. They were fantastic. We were so lucky to have them. But I thought, this guy's done his research. Oftentimes, the perception of people who were vaccine hesitant was that they hated science. And I was like, this guy has put more thought into this decision than anyone I think I've ever spoken to. And he said, I just want one of the later ones. And I was like, okay, sure. So I wrote a story, put it out there, didn't really think about it again. A couple months later, the vaccine he was waiting for was authorized. And so I thought, I'm going to call that guy back and just see how he's doing. And he was... I couldn't believe it. I still remember the phone call because we had initially what I thought was a pretty respectful, good conversation. And he was livid the second time, just absolutely livid, because he'd felt like we'd put him out there and he'd been criticized and shit on. I don't think I'm supposed to say shit. You already swore, so it's okay. But he felt like he had been shamed into a corner for the decision that he had really taken a lot of personal thought and attention to. And so I felt like I was just watching someone radicalize almost in real time. And so it was just such an, I don't know, a learning experience for me in terms of when people start to feel like they don't have the trust of their community or they're being shamed for their decisions. I get why people feel that way. Emotions were so high during the pandemic, but if the goal here is to move people towards better information, not making someone feel like part of the community was not the way to do that.
Well, and that's a huge thing. And so when we talk about disinformation, versus misinformation, it's intent, right? It's someone knows they're telling you the wrong information versus someone who is just spreading the wrong information. And obviously, whether you think government should spend more or less is not a misinformation, disinformation situation, right? There's lots of ways to have opinions about stuff, but the stuff that we talk about now, you can worry about lots of things in the world, right? Like I have 4 kids, so I worry about climate change. I worry what's happening in the United States. I worry about the bird flu. There's a lot of smart people starting to worry about the bird flu. I think the biggest problem in the world is this, I would say disinformation more than misinformation, but it's all the same bouillabaisse. Because every chance we have to solve a problem is filtered through that. So someone asked at some point in the pandemic when the opposition to vaccines was starting to become a real roar. It wasn't big, but it was loud. They said, how would this have worked when we were trying to introduce seatbelts, right? Or ban smoking in bars? Would we have gotten that done? And there was resistance at the time. Go watch newsreels. There was a huge resistance to those things. But I don't know if we would have successfully banned them. Because right now, if you want to send your unvaccinated kid to school in Toronto, you can do that. You need to get a form filled out, but that's about it. So when we talk about the idea of what the environment that we're living in is, that's what I worry about the most right now. Because when you start, you can spot stuff a mile away, right? And we can all do that, I think. With vaccines, I think it's relatively easy. And in Canada, remember, it's something like 85% of people got 2 doses in this country. We had enormous institutional trust. Where I think it's worrisome is, did you ever read the commencement speech by David Foster Wallace called "This Is Water"? It starts with 2 fish swimming along, right? And there's a fish swimming the other way and goes, how's the water? The two fish keep swimming. One turns to the other and goes, what's water? And that's where I think we are right now with this. I have a cousin, lovely woman. She just retired from a job managing a Walmart. And she, every once in a while, will tell me stuff like, I heard that there are kids in school using litter boxes. I have a next door neighbor who was a police officer in England. And he doesn't believe in the vaccine because there was a doctor who helped save his kid's life when she was 2 years old. And that doctor fell down an anti-vaccine hole, and he fell down with her. And he's never getting out. I go to the grocery store, and I hear people talking about chemtrails. It's everywhere. And it's everywhere in a way that I think it's going to get harder for even people who recognize it to recognize it. Does that make sense? Like
yeah.
the story you wrote about the 51st state site.
Mm-hmm.
Can
Yeah.
you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, no, definitely. I wrote a story last week, I don't know, years ago in election time. But it was a story about, this is one of those stories that I scared myself a little bit writing because it was a story about the buy and sell Facebook group in Hamilton. And so people have been selling their bicycles and baby clothes on this group for literally years. And then there was a moment, and if you scroll through the feed, you can actually pinpoint the exact moment where it pivoted from people being like, I need a bookshelf, to very pro-Trump, very xenophobic, very racist, very, kind of right-wing culture war coded. And it kind of tried a few different identities before settling on a pro-51st state group. And so suddenly, there's this group on Facebook that has 19,000 members, has been around for years, and claims to push this idea that Canadians are super excited to join the United States. And so that was such an alarming example to me of the fact that it's not even just the algorithms that we have to worry about, The promise of social media was that it was going to democratize conversation on the internet. We were all going to be able to go and share our views and have conversations and learn. And there has been some of that. I think we don't need to, totally dismiss the benefits of social media. But at the same time, that has not panned out. This idea of a digital, town square is really not a thing. You're not in ownership of your feed in the way that you think you are. Everyone can talk, but not everyone is heard. And so there's so many insidious ways that the information around you is not what you think it is spreading ideas that you don't believe in, is pushed by people you're not aware of. And as I say this, I can feel myself being like, oh, it is depressing. But I think we need to be clear about the corrosive impact of this. Because I think when people think misinformation, they think of the big bads. They think of Russia or China, trying to get you to believe a specific thing. And that is sometimes the problem. There was we won't get into the tenant lawsuit from last year. But anyway, that is sometimes the issue. But the problem with not being able to trust what you see online, even if you are aware of how science works and that chemtrails aren't a thing, even if you're aware of that, the fact that you now have to go online and be like, oh gosh, which is this AI? Is this real? I don't know what this is. It really makes you want to be just like, you know what? I don't know. I can't deal with this. I'm not going to engage. And we're in an election right now. And if you want to live in a world where people are engaged in issues and have opinions and, are pushing for the sort of community that they want to live in, this idea that you can't trust anything is very bad.
Well, so much of this is incentives, right? Because the incentive system has changed. There were bad newspapers. There were bad evening newscasts. But they didn't have the same profit incentive that misinformation has now. And it is interesting how it has primarily coalesced on one side of the political aisle. I wrote a piece yesterday about this. There was this report that came out of this Policy Horizons Canada, which said that by 2040, we are screwed. All your kids are going to be leaving the country. No one's going to want to go to school anymore. There's going to be food insecurity. We'll be foraging off the land. It sounds terrible. And it's possible. And this was spun by right-wing media in the country, then by Pierre Poilievre, and then by other more respectable, I would say, quote-unquote, right-wing media in the country, as being a report from a top and important policy shop at the highest levels of the government that says this is definitely what's going to happen. which that sounds terrible, doesn't it? That sounds awful. I asked a selection of people who had worked at the highest levels of policymaking in the country in the last 5 years. And I think there was 6 of them. So 4 of them had never heard of Policy Horizons Canada. And 2 of them had, and had never encountered it professionally at any level of government. And if you go look at their website, they put out a ton of different reports. And their whole job is to say, we're going to think of things that could happen plausibly that are bad, and we're going to put out a report about it. We're not going to be specific, we're going to guess. Think about that as an incentive system in politics. Think about that as an incentive system in social media. Think about how there's a huge incentive on this stuff now. And the AI is going to layer a layer of garbage kind of across the internet in a whole bunch of different ways. But I've now gotten to the point where if there's a video that I see, I will wait to presume it's real. Like it used to be, if you saw a news broadcast, you would just, a clip of a news broadcast, you could say, well, that's a news broadcast. I will wait, like, I don't know, an hour, check and see what other people say about it, see if anybody debunks it. And I'm relying on the wisdom of crowds to like guide me there. That's terrifying. Because if I've been dumb enough to fall for stuff. And I think I'm good at this. Because there's so much of it. So the question becomes, how I worry about, like, how do I teach my kids? And like everyone has to worry about, how do I protect myself from this? And the super easy and self-involved way for us to say that is read the Toronto Star and other respectable media outlets. And there's still a number of them. I don't know how many of those outlets will be here in 5 years, in 10 years, when my kids are my age. I don't know if that's going to exist anymore. And so in terms of protecting yourself, I don't know what the answer is. Do you?
I wish I had like a great, just do these 3 things and it'll be totally fine. But I do think it's hard. I mean, I do think it starts with having a little bit of humility about how hard this can be. I almost fell prey to a banking scam recently. Like it happens. They get you when you're busy, when you're distracted, you're not always feeling vigilant. So it can happen. So I think part of it is just recognizing that we're all susceptible to it. I think being a bit more of an observer of your own kind of learning process about, where you get information, where is it coming from? Have I read this in other sources? Read across sources. I think we all need to get better at investigating sources. Like I think a lot about, what like you kind of referenced that time when there'd be a local newspaper and you just kind of had to decide whether or not you liked the newspaper. And from there, you didn't have to do a lot of kind of sussing out trust, but it's like we've gone from like an environment of scarcity to an environment of abundance. All of a sudden, instead of trying to figure out, do I trust the Toronto Star or not, you have to go online and there's like 500 people telling you things. And so trying to figure out where this is coming from, do they have other motivations, what else have they said, it is very, very challenging. And the other thing I think about a lot is just, we often talk about misinformation in terms of trying to correct bad information, which is very true. But the other side of that coin is making sure that there is good information out there. Like this, again, to loop back to the pandemic for the 500th time. But, for a lot of the pandemic, it was hard sometimes to figure out, where to go for certain information. And part of that because things were just evolving very quickly. But there are a lot of subjects for which if you want to find real, good, authentic, credible information, it can be hard to do. And so something I think about is what are the ways, we can all be part of being a source of better information. And obviously we're lucky we work for a newspaper, so it's easy. But are there newspapers you could support or newsletters you could send out? Or, are there other ways you can be a resource? Because I think part of this is boosting good information, not just fretting about the bad.
And I would say on a small scale, it's harder. So one of the members of I worked on a pandemic team during the pandemic, and one of them, one of the best science writers in the country, and had a family member who was gone, was like all the way at the other end of the scale. How do you try to bring them back? And what Alex said earlier about the guy who got kind of shouted into a corner, I had to learn this over the course of the pandemic because right before Omicron, I was talking to these people who worked out of the University of Toronto on a kind of a project to go into low-income areas and try to convince them to be vaccinated. So I talked to a couple of them. I was actually really excited to write this story. It would have been a really nice story. And then Omicron happened like the next day. And what they said is like, you have to spend so much time and you have to get them to trust you. And again, like, think about that for like, any of you might have people in your life who are on a various scale of this stuff, right? Like when my cousin comes to me, or my wife's cousin comes to me and says, you know, I hear there's kitty litter in schools. I can't say, you idiot. You have to be, the thing with trying to fight the war on disinformation but specifically misinformation, you have to have a lot of humility. I think you're right about how you consume information, but you have to have a lot of generosity towards the people who don't do it well. And that's hard. It's hard because a lot of the people, like, I've been to an anti-vax protest outside a hospital, and I walked in there and I looked at everyone and I just spent the first 15 minutes watching people. And it was the loneliest people I've ever seen in my life. And I talked to some of them. I talked to one guy, he said, I've lost 90% of my former friends, but I have 500% more friends now. And the way he described it was almost like how someone, you know those people who like, they all have Volkswagen Bugs and they meet on the weekends and they drive around, they go to a restaurant? It's like that, but for information. That's what these things are. Quite often, they are social connections. They are tribal connections. And that's why when you try to argue with people, it doesn't work. And that's why it takes so much to pull people back out of it. But honestly, like, the first part is you have to be really careful about your information diet, and you have to be willing to admit when you get it wrong, and you have to check your priors and all that stuff. But the other part is you have to be generous with that information and with the understanding that this can get any of us. It can get any of us because this is now a predatory information sphere that we live in. Not entirely, but substantially. With people in your life specifically, that's where you can start fighting back on it, right? You can try to pull them back, but a lot of it you really have to be, and you might not get there because I know a lot of people have tried this and haven't gotten there, but you have to be so generous with understanding how scary this stuff is and how easy it is.
Are you aware, and I guess more broadly, are we aware of the birds aren't real thing?
Yes.
Yes?
How many people here are aware of the birds aren't real thing?
Yes.
Oh, this is a self-selecting audience. Good for you guys.
Yes, so fascinating. I interviewed the guy who started that. So, sorry, for those of us who didn't put our hand up, which is totally fair, you probably spend a more normal amount of time on the internet.
Also good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you guys as well.
Yeah. So the birds aren't real thing was kind of like a fake. Well, for a long time we didn't know if it was fake, which was weird. It was this conspiracy theory run by this guy in the U.S. I think he's like
one guy
who like went to some rally and thought it'd be funny to bring a sign that said birds aren't real. And I think a reporter saw it and was like, oh my gosh. And so they started writing about this guy and people started following him, and he had like bought a van and he wrote birds aren't real on it, and he started driving across the country and he got followers, and there were these huge rallies, and the whole time like there was all this lore about like birds are surveilling us and they sit on power lines because they're charging, and like it was a whole thing. And a lot of people were like, is this guy real?
He would do television interviews and he would be absolutely straight-faced. 100% birds are not real.
Yeah.
Why do you think birds are real? Like,
oh yeah. I mean, watch the interviews. They're so good.
They're actually incredible.
Yeah. Anyway, he revealed, I guess, in the New York Times, no less, I think last year, that in fact, it was a joke. And he had just started it as a joke, but it just kept going. But he, along the way, kind of gave himself a master's degree in like communications and how to talk to people about conspiracy theories. And so I interviewed him I think it was last year. Anyway, at some point I interviewed him. And it was so fascinating because he's such a young guy with such an interesting take on now how to talk people out of conspiracy theories. He does a lot of political communications in the States now and has gotten, work in politics and just has a really nuanced view, I think. But the piece of that interview that really struck me was he was like, people would come up to me at rallies and be like, "You're dumb, you're brain damaged, how dare you do this?" and just scream at him. And he was just like, if you truly think I have a brain injury, why are you yelling at me like this? And he was like, there were times where I could feel myself getting a little defensive and digging in his heels because I don't know, it's a human impulse when someone gets in your face and tells you you're an idiot. And he was like, I couldn't believe I was feeling this because obviously birds are real, just to be clear. But it was just such an interesting look at someone who has kind of lived that, experienced it, at least externally, if not internally. And he speaks now about, the work that he does to kind of bring people out of that, but leading it from a place of, respect and trying to be open and trying to find community for those people, really.
Well, and that's why one of the antidotes to all of this is honestly, like if you look at one of the most amazing stats in the world is if you look at the introduction of cell phones and teenagers, and the number of teenagers who are killing other teenagers has gone like this. And the number of teenagers who are killing themselves has gone like this. And the same number of teenagers are dying, more or less. It's just they're doing it alone. It's no longer a social activity. But that is one of the antidotes, I think, to all of this is you can't say we need to go back, right? Because we can't. The genie's out of the bottle. You can't ban AI. You can't ban social media. You can't ban the internet. I've kept my kids off cell phones until the eldest ones until they were 14. The 13-year-old still doesn't have one. That's the best I can kind of do with that kind of stuff. And then I teach them. But that's for me. But in terms of the way we can go back is to spend time together again. Like that idea of like bowling leagues, bowling alone. Yeah, like honestly, so the guy who's the anti-vaxxer is my next door neighbor. I'll like see him in the parking lot of the supermarket and he'll be like, "How's your heat pump doing?" And I'll be like, "It's great, man. It's really good. How's your heat pump doing?" I really like the heat pump. And he'll be like, "Have you seen the excess death rates in Europe?" And I'll be like, "I have." And it's not what you think. But I'm always willing to listen to him and I'm always like really friendly and generous about it. And then we hang out and we don't talk about that stuff. And the more you can hang out with other people, the more you can keep people from being alone, from being on a computer, from looking for community in a way that isn't community. It's a hard one. Third spaces are hard. The way the world is organized is hard. And the internet has everything. But that honestly might be the best way to pull as many of us out of this as possible. Because, I think a ton of this is not trusting the people who are supposed to take care of you and not having anyone to talk to about it. And that's when you wind up in a lot of people wind up in bad places. Alex, of all the stuff you've written, what are some of the ones that are the most insidious in terms of just everybody? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it's all the stuff that is, that's a good question, but just makes it so clear that we are not in control of our own internet experience. Yeah. Like I had a story out today about Facebook ads that were pro-NDP, but we did some digging around and it was run by a local former conservative operative. And so it felt like kind of a clumsy attempt to split the vote. I've written about the Facebook group that got turned into a 51st state thing. I haven't written about it, but other people have done great work about the fake news ads. So things that are advertisements on Facebook that are meant to look like the Globe or the Star or CBC or whatever, and then they always have like this like rotating cast of famous Canadians. Like Mary Berg was there for a while, and Howie Mandel is very popular, but they're currently.
That's how I found out who Mary Berg was. I didn't know who she was.
I will admit I had to Google it, and then I emailed her being like, "Hey, would you do an interview with me?" She did not respond.
No.
But there's just so many ways. That one, I gotta say, it always warms my heart a little bit because I'm like, oh, they think people trust the news enough to click on that. So it is, weirdly positive in that sense. But so much of this is about the hijacking of expertise and credibility and using names and using news sources and using, other people's credentials to make yourself look more accessible on the internet. And sometimes it's politically motivated. Sometimes it's just people looking to sell crypto. So there's just so much online about we are not in control of our own experience in the way that we think we are. And I just think that, part of our job is to illustrate that in a way that make people feel like they're understanding this a little bit more, because understanding is power. I think it's easy to throw your hands up and be like, oh, this, I don't know, nothing is true. But my hope anyway is that by doing a little bit more reporting like this, it puts the agency back in people's hands, because it is something really that affects all.
Well, and that idea of nothing is true is actually like Gary Kasparov has the great line about that, right? The goal of propaganda is not to convince you of one narrative, it's to convince you that there is no truth at all, because then nobody cares. Like everyone goes, every politician is corrupt. Every pharma company is corrupt. Every government is corrupt, and there's no difference between any of them. And the problem we are going to get, and the problem we've already got, is that disinformation is going to become political. Like political in terms of you have to vote against or for. And the United States has that in absolute like stark blazing relief right now. And we have it to a degree in Canada. And if I say that, it becomes problematic a little bit, because I'm a columnist, I can kind of write my opinion, but Alex isn't allowed to say that necessarily. But we are going to, in this country, get to a point, I think, unless the current kind of trends change, that it'll look a lot like the United States. It will be, you are voting for or against, not necessarily the political party, but which party is a disinformation force and which party is not. And that terrifies me in terms of where the country's going to go, as much as anything we've talked about.
We are at time.
Yes.
I was just going to say very, very quickly, have you read Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, it's a very little book. I picked it up in a bookstore recently. Very good. Would recommend it. You've probably seen a meme of it, maybe. He's a historian who writes about tyranny.
Who just moved to Toronto, actually.
Oh, yeah, new Torontonian.
Yeah.
I picked it up recently. Very easy read, definitely recommend. But it opens with a quote. Just you mentioned quotes, which are great guideposts. But it's a quote from a Polish philosopher, I believe. And it says, in politics, being deceived is no excuse. And I've been turning it around in my head since I read it, because again, in an election, being able to vote, being able to choose what sort of leadership we want, what sort of society we want to live in, it's a right, but it comes with the responsibility of being informed. And people can disagree, but in an ideal world, people would disagree based on, a different interpretation of the facts. And so, but in a world when it is so hard for even a well-meaning person to know what's true and what's credible, how does that change that equation? How do we make sure, how much do we hold people account for the false beliefs that they have? What are the ways that we can help them out of that in order to make sure that we're all making, responsible decisions? Anyway, good book,
Yeah.
recommend it.
And I think for all of us, just keep caring about it. Because that's the only way anything's ever going to get anywhere. And that's not just disinformation, that's everything. But yeah, keep caring about it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I think now do we get up?
Are we doing questions? Are we doing questions? Are we doing questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
10 minutes, okay.
Bruce, you're obviously a nicer person than I am, and it's not a high bar. I just wonder, so just to talk about how credulous the internet has made people, my favorite line from this week on Twitter was, "It should be possible to talk about Jackie Robinson without talking about his race."
Yes, thank you.
Which was fabulous. And I mean, it was meant tongue-in-cheek, but I actually had to look at it twice. But how do you not just call people out, whatever their need for community, whatever they've been fed or not? Would they say things like, and I saw it this morning, all babies need is love and sunshine and breast milk? And my answer is, go to a fucking cemetery.
Yeah.
Like, at some point, you just have to say to these people, no, you are demonstrably wrong. And I don't know how to balance that, because I think you're right too. I just don't know what that balance is.
I think the easy way to answer that, and there is no easy way to answer that, because you're right. Like, you do have to say it's wrong. I would just say, I wouldn't say go to a fucking cemetery. I would say go to a cemetery. But you're right, because that's the right answer, right? That's the right answer. Is like, but I wasn't like this, right? At the start of the pandemic, I was fucking furious. There was a moment at the end of the Delta wave where if you had 2 doses of the vaccine, you were in like the low 90s, and with the booster, we were going to get up into high 90s on both infection and on serious illness, and the pandemic was going to be over, man. And the only thing that was keeping it was that we didn't have everybody vaccinated, and that eventually got washed away by Omicron. And around then, I was angry, and a lot of people were really angry. And then the more I encountered them, the more I thought about it, the more I saw it in my own life. You still have to tell them they're wrong, and you have to help them. That's the thing. And that's where that's why the only difference between you and me there is fucking.
Can I add to that just one point? Because I just want to be really clear that I don't think either of us are saying, and I don't think this is what you're saying either, but there are people out there. Misinformation in its worst form enables our absolutely worst impulses. And there are some real shitty people out there. So for people who are being racist, xenophobic, whatever obic you want to add on to that, I'm not saying we need to go out and give them a hug or maybe even waste time on that at all. But I think my point, or my experience based on the people that I've spoken to, is that there's the really extreme people, and I don't even know if they're movable, but the people in the middle, the kind of confused middle of the road types, those are the ones who feel budgeable or teachable, or those are the ones who it feels like it's worth building relationships with. But I'm in no way, I don't want anyone to think that we're saying, and again, I don't think Bruce is saying this either, that you have to be nice to someone who's being really hateful or awful.
I will hug all of you, but I will not hug everybody. But no, I think that's exactly right. You have to persuade the people you can persuade. Some people can come back, not everyone.
Hi there. Appreciate both of your writing. And I'm just wondering, I also appreciate the idea of, analog relationships as an antidote to misinformation and disinformation. What are your thoughts on some of the policy or broader systemic interventions? We've got Bill C-36 that's being proposed in Canada, Online Harms Act, for those who don't know. Any thoughts on that, and is there a way in that way?
Well, one of the big architects of that bill is speaking on the stage tomorrow night, actually, Supriya Dwivedi. I think, the problem you get, and this is a problem with emerging fascism, is that it becomes tempting to fight it with fascism, right? But regulation of the internet is a real thing, and it needs to happen. Like, algorithmic regulation probably needs to happen. I think that, like, if you look at what happened with Twitter, it used to be that Twitter, before Elon Musk, was still a shit show, but it had a sorting system where the best ideas and the smartest and the funniest stuff, the wisdom of crowds, surfaced up to the top. And that's how you found that stuff on Saturday Night Live, and you found that stuff on the CBS Evening News, right? There was a pipeline of popular sentiment among a certain group of people, and it was sortable. That's no longer sortable, right? So you do need algorithmic honesty. But yeah, in terms of, I don't know how governments can encourage analog relationships. That's like a super interesting policy question. Like, I mean, I would say build more bowling alleys. I think bowling's awesome. Like, a bowling alley is one of my happiest places in the world. But like that, but like, yeah, like, but like, if as a society you can make more places for people to go, that's probably your best policy intervention, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I do, the part of, sorry, your question that kind of hooked me a little bit is this question of can we regulate our way out of this a little bit? Because I think it's a fair one. Coming out of COVID, I spent a lot of time thinking about what are the problems we can solve at the individual level, what are collective problems, because I think we have a bad habit sometimes of like putting collective problems on individual shoulders. Like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes about people being like, well, the solution to misinformation is teaching 14-year-olds how to recognize bad things, which is part of it. We should definitely do that. But like, I also don't think it's fair to like line up junior high students and like send them out into unfiltered TikTok. Like
Yeah.
that, and I don't think that's what you're saying, but it just,
Yeah.
there are probably some systemic things we could do here too. When I think of like the fake news ads that are still plaguing us in the election, I mean, I wrote about that a year ago. And so we could say this stuff is hard to get rid of, which it is. There's some interesting research out of the social media lab actually in Toronto about the way in which they like change the image that they're using to get past the filters. You could also say that Meta is maybe not very serious about stamping some of this stuff because it incentivizes selling us things, selling ads. There's a big reason why I'm not saying I don't have any knowledge here, but there are reasons why they would be less serious about stamping this stuff out than maybe we would have. So things like, the algorithm is hard, but like transparency over who's buying ads, transparency about who's doing things at all, getting rid of bots, getting rid of, accounts that don't have, any sort of verified information around them. I gotta wonder that there's some of this might be possible.
But you do wind up with like the idea of age verification for pornography, for example. It's basically impossible. But it's also, everyone puts their driver's licenses in porn sites on the internet. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that on any level, but I really don't want to do that from a privacy perspective because I'm old enough to remember privacy, right? It's hard, man. It's so hard.
Okay, we have time for, I think, one more quick question. We got about 2 minutes. So I'll come around. Okay, who was it over? You're welcome.
I too grew up under communism, and the one thing that I learned was how important education is from a young age, because my parents taught me from a young age to think, verify, find multiple sources for every piece of information. So I'm wondering why in this province, well, I can understand why in this province because of who is our premier, but why perhaps in a future province, education isn't a focus. Like I know in Finland, they start in kindergarten educating children in an age-appropriate way about misinformation and disinformation. And why is that not first, like, because I've just read today, I don't think it was either of you guys, something about Gen Z is the least discerning consumer of information possible. Okay, that's not encouraging. So why aren't we in the schools shouting about this? And parents of 4 children. I only have 2, but they're in their 30s, so
We
they're
should.
lost.
We 100% should. Why does Finland do it? Because they're right next to, exactly. And who are we next to? Like if you talk to some really, you can see how this stuff leaks up from the United States. You can. It's super easy. But yeah, we should do it in schools, 100%. Yeah. But the one problem you get with that is that curriculum gets changed if there is not a consensus over the curriculum. And I don't think in this country there would be. I think it would get changed from government to government. And I think you'd never get it in Alberta for longer than 4 years.
Yeah, I didn't write that story, but I wrote a similar one, I'm assuming, last year, because that was a big wake-up call for me, because I think a lot of us assume that, young folks, Gen Z, who grew up on the internet are somehow immune to this stuff. And it turns out those of us who didn't grow up as much online have kind of an armor that we've built from just real-world experience. Like, Gen Z are much more likely to fall prey to conspiracy theories about, like, Princess Diana dying, or just stuff that they were not alive for, so they actually don't know what the facts are. But I was impressed doing that story just how much of a hunger there is for that sort of education. Like, they're not unaware that this is an issue. So it is hard. It's hard across provinces. You'd have to do it province by province. I think people are slowly waking up to it, and students would certainly be receptive. But yeah, agree. It would be nice to see.
Well, one other thing, just a super quick thing on why the people who are of the pre-internet, this weird tribe that pretty much everyone in this room belongs to, kids don't read encyclopedias anymore, man. They don't exist. So if they're trying to figure out what happened with Lady Di, and you're just typing it into Google, good luck. That's what they're growing up with, though. How did you learn things? How do kids today learn things? They are fundamentally different processes. So it used to be that young people were the most liberal people in society. And I think that's going to change for a number of reasons, and one of them is this. Is that it?